Have you ever imagined what the American road would look like if a car company decided to build a station wagon that wasn't boring? See, back in the mid-50s, Ford owned the wagon market. But let's be real, their cars were basically wooden crates on wheels. Practical? Sure. Exciting? Not even close. That's when Chevrolet decided to flip the script. They took the aggressive style of the Corvette, added a roof, and created the Nomad. It wasn't designed to haul plywood, it was designed to turn heads. It was sleek, expensive, and completely unnecessary, and that's exactly why we love it. This is the story of the car that made Ford look like ancient history, and in this video, we're going to take a closer look at it. To truly understand why the Nomad was such a shock to the system, you have to look at what American roads looked like in 1954. This was the era of the Woody. If you wanted a station wagon, you bought a car heavily influenced by pre-war timber construction. They were boxy, they had thick pillars, and they were designed with a form-follows-function mindset. Ford was the king of this style. They were selling thousands of wagons because they were cheap to build and easy to fix. General Motors, on the other hand, was in the middle of an identity crisis. They had just launched the Chevrolet Corvette in 1953, but it was flopping. It was underpowered, it leaked water, and serious sports car guys laughed at it. Harley Earl, the legendary head of GM design and the man who invented the concept car, was furious. He needed a way to force the public to respect Chevrolet's new design language. He didn't just want a better sports car, he wanted the sporty look to bleed into every single car Chevy sold. So, for the 1954 General Motors Motorama, an extravagant car show held at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, Earl ordered his team to do something radical. He told them to take the Corvette's fiberglass body, stretch the roofline, and turn a two-seater roadster into a station wagon. They called it the Waldorf Nomad. When the curtain lifted at the Waldorf, the crowd didn't just politely clap, they lost their minds. The car was painted in a shimmering silver blue. It sat low to the ground. It had the Corvette's aggressive front grille, the wire mesh headlight guards, and a roof that looked like it was chopped by a hot rodder. It looked like it was moving 100 miles per hour while parked on the carpet. For the first time ever, people weren't looking at a station wagon and thinking about soccer practice. They were thinking about drag racing. The reaction was so violent that GM executives panicked. In a good way, they saw the crowd swarming the Nomad concept and ignored the other cars on the stage. The order came down from the top brass immediately. Build this car and have it ready for the 1955 model year. But there was a massive problem. The Waldorf Nomad was a fiberglass concept car. It was hand-built, lightweight, and didn't have to pass any safety or durability tests. The production car, however, had to be built on the standard 1955 Chevrolet a-body steel chassis. The engineers were given an impossible deadline. They had to translate the sleek, curvaceous lines of a fiberglass dream car into rigid, heavy sheet metal. And this is where the Nomad stopped being just a trim package and became an engineering marvel. Most car companies would have just taken their standard wagon, painted it a cool color, and called it a day. But Chevy engineers were obsessed with keeping the specific design cues that made the concept car so famous. First, they tackled the wheel wells. Look at a 1955 Ford Country Squire. The rear fenders are flat and low, covering the top of the tire. It looks heavy and dignified. Now, look at the Nomad. The engineers cut the rear wheel wells high and round, fully radiused. This was a direct carryover from the Corvette. It exposed the entire wheel and tire, giving the car a raked stance that suggested speed and power. Then they tackled the A-pillars, the metal posts holding up the windshield. On a standard 1955 Chevy sedan, these were relatively vertical. On the Nomad, they slanted them forward aggressively. This required a completely unique windshield glass and door frame that wasn't shared with other models. It was a manufacturing headache, but it gave the car a sense of forward motion that the Ford simply didn't have. But the biggest challenge, and the feature that would define the car forever, was the B-pillar. Or rather, the lack of one. In 1955, practically every station wagon on the road was built with a thick steel post right behind the driver's door, known as the B-pillar. It wasn't there for looks, it was there for survival. Station wagons were long, heavy vehicles with massive roof spans. That pillar was the only thing keeping the roof from buckling or the body from twisting when the car hit a bump. It made the car structurally sound, but it also made it look like a rolling cage. Chevy engineers looked at that pillar and decided to do the impossible: delete it. They engineered the Nomad as a true hardtop. This meant that when you rolled the front windows down and slid the rear windows forward, there was nothing but open air from the windshield all the way to the curved rear glass. This sounds simple today, but in 1955, it was an engineering nightmare. Without that central pillar, the car lost a massive amount of rigidity. To fix this, Chevy had to reinforce the frame and the door sills with extra steel, adding weight and cost to every single unit. But the result was a sleek, pillarless silhouette that made the Ford Country Squire look like a farm truck. When you pulled up next to a Ford at a stoplight, the Nomad looked like a convertible that just happened to have a roof. And speaking of that roof, it became the single most controversial part of the manufacturing process. If you look closely at the top of a Nomad, you'll see 7 distinct grooves running horizontally across the metal. These are called flutes. On the original fiberglass concept car, these were just styling tricks to make the car look lower. But on the production car, they became a necessity. The roof of the Nomad was a massive, relatively flat sheet of steel. Without any support, a piece of metal that large would wobble and vibrate at highway speeds, a phenomenon engineers call oil canning. It would create a deafening booming noise inside the cabin. Chevy had 2 choices: add ugly internal cross braces that would ruin the headroom, or press these flutes into the steel itself. They chose the flutes. By stamping these ribs into the roof, they added structural rigidity without adding weight. It was a brilliant solution that turned a manufacturing problem into a signature design element. It cost a fortune to build the stamping dies for just one low-volume model, but GM didn't care. They were building a flagship. The obsession with style over function didn't stop at the roofline. It extended into the glasswork, specifically the rear quarter windows. On a normal wagon, the rear windows either didn't open at all or they rolled down into the body. But because of the Nomad's unique wheel well design, there was no room inside the body for the glass to go down. So, the engineers created a unique sliding glass system. The curved rear windows slid forward on tracks. While this looked incredibly futuristic, it was notoriously difficult to seal. In a heavy rainstorm, Nomad owners often found water dripping onto their expensive carpet. But again, this was the trade-off: style first, utility second. And then, we have to talk about the tailgate. This is perhaps the clearest example of how far ahead Chevy was compared to Ford. If you open the back of a 1955 Ford Country Squire, it was a crude experience. You had a heavy lower gate held by rattling chains that chipped the paint, and an upper glass hatch held by primitive hinges. It felt heavy. It felt industrial. The Nomad used a sophisticated hidden torsion bar counterbalance system. The mechanism was tucked away inside the roof, completely invisible. When you turned the chrome handle on the liftgate, the heavy glass and steel structure would float upward with just the pressure of a single finger. There were no chains to rattle, no struts to get in the way. It was elegant. It was seamless. It felt like opening the door of a jewelry box, not a cargo truck. Inside the cabin, the anti-Ford philosophy reached its peak. The interior of the Nomad wasn't shared with the lower trim Chevy 150 or 210 models. It was exclusive. Chevy developed a unique waffle pattern vinyl specifically for this car. It was heat-pressed into the seats and door panels, creating a geometric texture that looked and felt completely different from standard automotive upholstery. It felt more like a high-end, mid-century modern sofa than a car seat. The headliner wasn't just cloth glued to the roof. It was held up by chrome bows that ran the length of the ceiling, mimicking the exterior roof flutes. Every time you sat inside a Nomad, the car reminded you, "You didn't buy this to haul lumber. You bought this to be seen." So, why do we say this car humiliated Ford? It wasn't about the sales numbers. In fact, if you look strictly at the charts, Ford was still the undisputed wagon master. They sold thousands of country squires for every single Nomad that left the dealership lot. But the Nomad did something Ford couldn't do. It became a status symbol. When the Nomad hit the showroom floor in 1955, it carried a base price of $2,571. That might not sound like much today, but in 1955, that was an exorbitant amount of money for a Chevrolet. It was the most expensive car in the entire lineup, more expensive than a Bel Air convertible, and significantly more expensive than the Ford wagons. For the first time in history, the station wagon wasn't the cheapest car in the neighborhood. It was the one you bought to show off. Ford executives were watching this happen, and they were terrified. They saw the magazines raving about the Nomad's space-age design. They saw celebrities and wealthy suburbanites, people who would never usually be caught dead in a Chevrolet, suddenly placing orders. Ford was so panicked by the cool factor of the Nomad that they scrambled to build a direct competitor. They couldn't let Chevy own the sport wagon market. So, in 1956, they rushed the Ford Parklane to market. The Parklane was designed specifically to fight the Nomad. It had extra chrome, fancy interior trim, and a high price tag, but it was a rush job, and it showed. Unlike the Nomad, the Parklane wasn't a true hardtop. Ford didn't have the time or the money to re-engineer their roof, so they just took their standard two-door ranch wagon and glued a thick chrome strip over the B-pillar to fake the pillarless look. It was a parts bin car trying to compete with a bespoke masterpiece, and while the Parklane actually outsold the Nomad that year, because it was cheaper, it never captured the public's imagination. It was a copycat. The Nomad was the original. However, the story of the Nomad has a tragic twist. As beautiful as it was, the Nomad had a fatal flaw that would eventually kill it. That sleek two-door sporty design that looked so good on the showroom floor was a nightmare for actual families. In the 1950s, families were big. If you were a mother with 3 or 4 kids, the last thing you wanted to do was climb out of the driver's seat and fold it forward every time a child needed to get in or out of the back. The sporty two-door layout was its downfall. The practical buyers went to Ford because Ford offered 4-door wagons that made sense. The wealthy buyers eventually moved on to Cadillacs. The Nomad was stuck in the middle, too expensive for the average Joe, and too much of a Chevy for the rich. Chevy only sold around 8,386 units in 1955. In 1956, that number dropped to 7,886. By 1957, despite the car becoming even more beautiful with the famous 57 Chevy fins, sales barely hovered over 6,000. The writing was on the wall. The unique body style, the expensive roof stamping, and the complex tailgate were simply costing GM too much money. The Halo car had lost its shine. In 1958, Chevrolet redesigned their entire lineup. The name Nomad survived, but the magic was dead. The 1958 Nomad was just a trim level on a standard 4-door station wagon. It had a B-pillar, it had standard windows, it was just a car. The experiment was over. But this brings us to the ultimate irony. Ford won the battle of the 1950s. They moved more metal, made more money, and dominated the suburbs. But Chevrolet won the war of history. Today, a 1956 Ford Parklane is a cool curiosity, a nice classic car you might see at a local show, worth maybe $30,000 or $40,000 in good condition. But a 1955 to 1957 Chevy Nomad, it is a 6-figure legend. It is one of the most collected, restored, and modified cars on the planet. Collectors will pay upwards of $100,000 for a pristine example. Why? Because it represents a moment in time when a massive corporation decided to stop being boring. It proved that a utility vehicle didn't have to be ugly. It proved that a wagon could have a soul. And most importantly, it proved that sometimes the perfect car isn't the one that sells the most, it's the one that people remember 70 years later. So now it's your turn. Would you rather have the practical Ford that did its job, or the beautiful Chevy that broke the rules? Let me know in the comments below. The information in this video was gathered from the sources shown on screen. As always, you can find the sources in the Google Doc linked in the description. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe and click on that recommended video on the screen. It's the story we mentioned earlier about when Ford built the perfect station wagon. It's the other side of this battle, and you definitely don't want to miss it. I'll see you in the next video.